Rockies in Bozeman, Montana. We are so excited that you're here for today's program on women's suffrage. My name is Angie. I'll be your host for today's program. One quick note before we get started. We're using the Zoom platform. Today we're going to use the chat box to respond to both questions from Lisa. You can chat back your answers. And then that's also where you can ask questions of us too. Throughout the program, our team, you'll hear from Callie and Sophie here behind the scenes also, we'll be sharing your answers and your questions with Lisa. So we're ready to get going. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about women's suffrage and women's suffrage in the West, partially because we are, of course, on the eve of a national election. So a really exciting time to talk about voting, but also exciting because 2020 is the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. Now, before we jump into this, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. So if we want to move the slide forward. So I am located in Bozeman, Montana, as Angie said, at the Museum of the Rockies. You see the Montana map there. So if you're not from Montana, this is where Bozeman's located. It's circled in red down in the southwest corner of the state. We're just above Yellowstone National Park. And if we go forward another slide, this is what the Museum of the Rockies looks like. So that is where I am located right now. If you've ever been here before, this probably looks familiar to you. I will say that you can see that there is a T-Rex skeleton or a statue of one outside of our front door. And that probably tells you that we have a lot of dinosaur bones here, but we also have a lot of what we call cultural history artifacts or material culture. And that means that those are artifacts that humans have made or used or interacted with over the course of history. And that's what I do here at the museum. I care for all of those objects. And so we use those objects to explore the past, to explore history. And you see here I am in one of our other storage areas, and I'm surrounded by different types of material culture or cultural history. So that means anything from clothing to photographs to tools to furniture. I'm standing in front of some organs and pianos right now. So all of these things tell us about the past and about how people used to live. And so, for example, if we looked at wherever you are right now, whether that's your classroom or your home, everything that surrounds you is material culture. So we would be able to learn about you by looking at the things you surround yourself with. So today what we're going to do is use material culture from the past to explore women's suffrage and the fight for women's suffrage, both nationally, in the Western states, and in Montana specifically. Before we get going, I do want to really quickly acknowledge that Museum of the Rockies is situated on lands that have been historically and are currently inhabited by Indigenous cultures, Indigenous tribes, and we want to make sure that we honor and respect those historic and ancestral ties as well as current ties to the land. So you can see on the slide here, I have the names of several tribes that have historic claims and current claims to the land where Museum of the Rockies is. And I would highly recommend that you take a moment to explore the different tribes that have ties to where you currently live. So with that said, we can move forward and we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about what the structure of today will look like. So like I said, we're going to talk about women's suffrage, and we're going to learn a little bit about it on the national level. Then we're going to focus that into the Western states. We're going to focus that in again to Montana, and then we'll end talking about the national level again. So let's head forward. And I'll be asking you questions throughout today as well, so do be sure to make use of that chat box, or if you have questions for me, go ahead and type those in as well. Before we really jump in, I have a couple vocabulary terms to talk to you about because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm going to use these terms a lot today. So the term franchise is essentially a right or a privilege that's given to a person or a group of people. And usually when we talk about the franchise, we're talking about voting. And that's essentially, I'm going to use franchise and suffrage pretty interchangeably today. So suffrage, when we say that, we're talking about the right to vote specifically, and especially the women's right to vote. So I'll say the suffrage movement or the fight for the franchise, and those are going to mean about the same thing. So you can be enfranchised, you can have the right to vote, or you can be disenfranchised and not have the right to vote. And finally, we're going to use the term suffragist today, not the term suffragette, which you might have heard in other lessons that you've had. And that's because the term suffragette was originally intended as an insult to people who wanted the right to vote for women. So a suffragist is someone who fights for women's rights to vote. And so you can see in the cartoon on the side of your screen here, that's an example of that material culture. This is a cartoon from the early 1900s, and it shows how it's an anti-suffrage, an anti-women's voting cartoon. And you can see here that this cartoon essentially implies that only women who are old and unmarried and kind of ugly and angry become suffragists. So cartoons like this were meant to discourage women from wanting the right to vote. So like I said, we're going to use the term suffragist and lots of these other terms throughout today. We're going to start out, like I said, on that national level. So we're going to go all the way back in time to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. And that took place over in New York, so across the country from where I'm currently standing. And we're talking about this convention because it was the first women's rights convention in the United States. It was organized by women, and it was meant to specifically talk about women's status in the United States. So it was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at the end of the convention, all of the attendees signed something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And what the Declaration of Sentiments was a list of social and legal changes that they wanted to see for women in the country. And one of those resolutions was the right to vote. That's what's really big on your screen there. And this was really controversial at the time in 1848. This is not something that all of the attendees believed in, and there was a lot of debate about it, but it was eventually included, and this is where we see that women's suffrage movement to get women the elective franchise or the right to vote. This is where it really takes off. And we start seeing some organizing in the next few years. But like many things in the United States, the movement for women's suffrage was interrupted by the Civil War. So even though we saw some movement after that Seneca Falls Convention, it got interrupted by the Civil War. And we don't see big movement on women's suffrage until 1869. So that's after the Civil War ended. And like I said, we're still on that national level because what happened at the national level really affects suffrage in our Western states. So in 1869, the National Suffrage Association decides to split into two different groups. You see those on your screen here. We had the National Women's Suffrage Association, and what they wanted was a constitutional amendment giving all women the right to vote. Then we had the American Women's Suffrage Association, and what they wanted was a state-by-state approach to women's suffrage. So one state at a time would give women the right to vote. So I'm going to give you the pros and cons of some of those, but in your chat box, I want you to tell me which approach do you think would be the one that you would support? What would you want, a federal constitutional amendment or the state-by-state approach? So you can type that in as I'm talking. So when it comes to a constitutional amendment, a couple of the pros for that are that it affects all women at one time. It grants universal suffrage across, we're going to go back, across the country. And it allows our suffragists to focus all of their energy, all of their time, all of their money just on the federal government, so they can really target the federal government. But a con is that in order to get a constitutional amendment passed, you still need to get 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So it's not just as easy as getting the federal government to say, okay. Now, when it comes to a state-by-state approach, A couple of the cons are that it's a little bit slower, right? It's just one state at a time. And that grants unequal rights throughout the country. So some women will be able to vote, some women won't be able to vote. But it allows suffragists to put their efforts at states that seem more likely to grant women's suffrage. And if enough states pass suffrage, then a constitutional amendment will naturally follow, because that's how our government is set up. Did we have any responses on what people would choose?
Yeah, we have a couple. We have one state by state, okay, two state by state, and one constitutional, and then we also have a question. Was Montana a big part of the fight for women's suffrage?
It was, and we'll get to that. So we'll make sure that we cover all of the effects that Montana had on the fight for women's suffrage, definitely. So a couple different answers, some state by state, some constitutional amendment, and we're gonna jump forward a slide because there's not a wrong answer, actually. And over the next 20 years, there actually wasn't very much movement on suffrage from either side. So our national groups that had previously split apart decided they were going to join back together. And so they decided once they joined back together that they would go after a state-by-state approach. And they decided to do this as a big group because they figured that any progress was better than no progress. And they did make some progress. If you see on your screen here, another great piece of cultural history is this other cartoon. But over the next 25 years, 11 states all approved women's suffrage. And all of those states were west of the Mississippi River. So they're all Western states. And so I'm going to ask you guys, you can see the 11 states on your screen there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this cartoon, but which state do you think was first and why do you think that? So you can answer that in the chat box and we'll come back to those answers in a little bit. I do want to say that this is very different from the cartoon that we saw earlier. This is a pro-suffrage cartoon. So you can see here, it's called The Awakening. And Lady Liberty is walking across the country. She wears golden robes that say votes for women. And you see that she's walking towards all these people on the eastern half of the country who are reaching out for her. So this is meant to imply that the states in the West have seen the light, they've given women the right to vote, and the states in the East are still waiting for that. So before I come back to your questions, we're going to move one screen forward, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why the West might have been first, why all of those states were in the West. So there's not one specific reason. There's a couple different reasons why the West was more likely to give women the right to vote. And the first one is a couple different political reasons. So you might know that our federal government is, representation in our government is partially based on population, especially in our House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. So our Western states politicians realized that if they had higher population numbers, they'd have more representation in the federal government. And so in the West, politicians thought if they gave women the right to vote, more women would move to the West, and then we would have more impact at the federal level. The other political reason is that different political parties in the West decided that if they gave women the right to vote, then women might vote for that political party. So it was a little bit of a race to see who could give women the right to vote first, because then women might be so thankful that they would vote for that party. The next reason is this idea in the West of homesteading and pioneer culture. So the piece of cultural history that you have on your screen right now is a picture of two women homesteaders in Montana. We know that in our homesteading communities, they were way more likely to support women's suffrage. And that might be because up to 12% of homesteaders were single women. And so because they're single women owning their own land, owning their own homes, they might naturally be more inclined to support women's suffrage. We also know that in our pioneer families, men and women split the workload really equally. Because men were the ones who were voting on women's suffrage, Men in the West may have seen the women as equals to themselves, and so they might have been more likely to vote in favor of women's suffrage. Our third reason is different women's, what we call social or civic groups. And all across the country, women were joining different types of social groups organized around things like religion or shared interests or social issues. And this was really important in the West because women didn't have nearly as many social opportunities or outlets as women in the East did. And so these social groups become really important for the women's suffrage movement because they help spread the message of women's suffrage all around the West. So do we have any answers on what our first state to allow women's suffrage was?
Yeah, we have two people slash classes that said Wyoming.
Did they give any reasons for why they thought Wyoming?
Nope.
Nope. Well, great guesses, and you can hit forward really quickly. You guys are right, it was Wyoming. Wyoming was the first state in this country to allow women's suffrage. And I actually have two dates here for Wyoming because Wyoming gave women the right to vote way back when it became a territory in 1870, and then it kept the right to vote for women in 1890. So that's when Wyoming became a state. And so these, you can see all of the other first 11 states that gave women's suffrage lined up there, as well as the years that they gave women's suffrage. And you see that Montana is one of the last there in 1914. And we're going to talk about Montana in just a minute. So we can head forward. Before we jump into the pro-suffrage arguments, I want to talk a little bit about anti-suffrage arguments. So why did people think that women should not have the right to vote? I outlined a couple here. They might be kind of hard to see for you, but this is another great piece of cultural history. It's a leaflet put out by the Montana Association opposed to women's suffrage. And I'll just sum up some of these arguments for you. What these are essentially saying is that women should stick to their home lives, that women are masters of the home and that's where they should stay. Some of the other arguments are that women already have enough to think about. They should not think about politics. That would just be too much strain for them. And then some of the other major arguments are that women would become worse mothers and worse homemakers and that it might ruin the family if they were given the right to vote. And we see those arguments repeated in a couple different political cartoons, so more material culture here. So you see on the left-hand side, this cartoon says that basically you can be a good mother and homemaker or you can be a political suffragist, but you can't be both. So you see on the left-hand side, the woman looks very calm, she looks very put together, her hair is back, she's holding a child. And on the right-hand side, the suffragist, the political woman, looks really angry. She's yelling, her hair is flying about, her eyes are dark, her mouth looks angry. And so these arguments are really effective, actually, because many women, they were primarily mothers and homemakers. So to be told that if you got the right to vote and to be told that would make you a worse mother or it would make you neglectful, that was really scary for people. And so it actually was an effective argument. So we can move forward. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about Montana specifically because Montana was one of the later states in the West to give women the right to vote. So Montana learned a lot from all of our other state suffrage battles. And I do want to make it really clear that it is the people, it's dedicated men and women who are changing the power structures in these individual states. It's a power change in the government coming from the citizens and from the people. So how did they argue against these arguments that you just saw that were anti-suffrage? So a couple of our pro-suffrage arguments why women should have the right to vote. The first one I have up there is that essentially they were saying that women should not be made to follow laws that they had no say in. And this is an argument that we see all throughout history. So even if you go all the way back to the American Revolution and you hear no taxation without representation, it's the same idea, right? If women don't have a say in their lawmakers, then they shouldn't have to follow the laws that those lawmakers create. One of our other basic arguments is that women are equal to men. They were created equally, and they should be seen as equals by the government and given equal votes. So those are our two more basic arguments. But what the suffragists came up with to really combat that cartoon that you just saw, that leaflet that you just saw, is this idea of a morality argument. And so what our suffragists were saying, our pro-suffrage folks, is that women would actually be better voters because they were wives and mothers. So they said that women would vote for things that would make the West a more civilized place. So they would vote for better working hours. They would vote to improve the lives of the poor. They would vote to end drinking and drunkenness. And they would make laws that would protect children and improve schools. So that's our argument against those claims that women would be worse wives and mothers. Instead, they were saying that because women are wives and mothers, they would be better voters. This is one of my favorite objects that you're seeing from our collection here at the museum. It's a booklet called All the Reasons Why You Should Not Vote for Women's Suffrage. And on the inside, all of the pages are blank. And then on the back cover, it says, there are none. There are no reasons to not give women the right to vote. So let's talk a little bit about how we get these messages out. Like I said, Montana learned a lot from other states in the West. The woman that you see on the left is Jeanette Rankin, and she became one of the major organizers of the pro-suffrage movement in Montana. So Jeanette Rankin was from Montana originally, and she worked on lots of other suffrage campaigns in other Western states, and she knew that you had to be organized to make change happen. So we don't often see social or legal change happen without strong organization. So she came back to Montana and she helped organize all these different individual groups and people who supported suffrage so that they had a unified message and they were all working towards the same goal. And so what they did is lots of different ways to get that message out once we had organized our groups. One of those examples is this leaflet on the right-hand side that's to help, again, push back against some of those other arguments. This is one of thousands of different types of leaflets that were printed by our pro-suffrage folks. And so this was to be distributed all throughout the state with arguments for why women should have the right to vote. This was actually put together by a teachers organization. So we had printed leaflets and newspapers that the suffragists would create. They went on speaking tours, they had parades. So really getting that message out in lots of different ways as part of a coordinated effort throughout the entire state. I do want to talk about our speaking tours for a minute, because for a woman to go out and speak to crowds in public at this time was really unusual, and it was really not what society expected. And you know that when you look at the cartoons that I've shown you earlier. These are just close-ups. So they show you how women are portrayed that go out and speak in public. So our suffragists that go out in public and speak on street corners and speak to all these different types of organizations were really pushing back against what society expected of them. And that was really difficult for them to do. So it was really brave. And our suffragists went out and they spoke all around the state to all kinds of people. They spoke to churches, they spoke to mining camps and to loggers and to farmers. They went into schools and they spoke to school kids and hoped that those kids would go home and talk to their parents about suffrage and why women should have the right to vote. So our suffragists are really pushing back against what society expected of them. And one of my favorite people is this woman here named Belle Flemingman. And you can actually forward one more. And Belle was 22 years old. She was from Helena, Montana. And she was one of those people that traveled all around the state speaking to different groups and different organizations. And this is where those social and civic organizations come back in. So speakers like Belle would go to all of these different women's groups and speak to them. And then those women's group members would help go out and campaign in their own neighborhoods. But you can see here, this is a quote from Belle on your screen about how her mother felt about her speaking in public. And you can see that she starts out by saying, "My mother was horrified." So again, this is how our suffragists are not only pushing back against the idea that women shouldn't have the right to vote, but they're even just pushing back against how women should act in society, how women should act in public. And this is really difficult for lots of women, but they persevered anyways. And of course, our suffragists also put on lots of different types of big events. This is a picture from a parade that was in Helena, Montana, the day before the state voted on women's suffrage. Thousands of people came to this parade, and this was an opportunity to have speakers like Belle talk. It was an opportunity to give out those leaflets and to put out a really positive impression of women's suffrage. And it was successful. The next day, Montana gave women the right to vote in the state in 1914. Which brings us back, of course, to our national level. So by the time Montana gave women the right to vote, suffragists on the national level were getting kind of tired about how slow suffrage was taking, how long it was taking. Because again, remember that after 25 years of campaigning, only 11 states had approved women's suffrage. So at the national level, our suffragists decided they were going to go back to the idea of a constitutional amendment. So like I said, none of you were wrong earlier. There are lots of different ways to go about this, and it took all of those methods to get women the right to vote. So what I think is really great is that women from states that had already been given the right to vote actually headed to Washington, D.C. to help campaign for a national constitutional amendment. One of those women from Montana is a woman named Hazel Hunkins, and you see her on your screen on the right here. And you also see her on the left. She's just in the background of this picture. And it's at this time, around 1915 to 1920, that we see the campaign tactics. We see all the same ones that we used in the West, right? We see parades and leaflets and speakers, but we also see our suffragists get a little bit more aggressive. We see picket lines. We see women chaining themselves to the White House gates. We see women and suffragists blocking traffic. Hazel here actually was arrested at least 3 different times for disorderly conduct and obstructing traffic. And she even went on a hunger strike while she was in jail one time. So our suffragists are really pushing very hard to get women the right to vote. And they are successful. It took several years, but by 1919, the Congress decided that they would take up the idea of women voting in the country. And so in 1919, Congress proposed the 19th Amendment to the United States. And you see the text here on your screen. So once again, another great piece of cultural history that helps us understand the past. So while Congress approved the 19th Amendment all the way back in 1919, it took a whole year for the amendment to get ratified, because remember, 3/4 of the states have to ratify an amendment in order to make it law. So the 19th Amendment wasn't law until August of 1920. So once again, it's the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. I do want to point out here, though, that the 19th Amendment did not give all women the right to vote. It gave women who are citizens the right to vote, which primarily meant white women and African American women at that time. But we also know that many African American women were kept from voting because of intimidation at the polls and because of now things that are illegal, like literacy tests. So just because women had the right to vote didn't mean that they were actually able to use that right. What I also put on here, and I would encourage all of you in your classes to do, is to think about who else did this amendment leave out, because there were many women who were not able to become citizens at this time, including Native American women and some Asian women. And so what I have on your screen there are a couple additional pieces of law that you might want to look into if you're interested in voting rights. And I'm almost ready for your questions, but I do just want to say that we are, of course, very excited to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but it's also really important to be thinking about voting rights in this country over the last 100 years and to think about who is still fighting for their voting rights, because not everyone is enfranchised yet. So do take some time to look into that as we're on the eve of yet another historic election. And with that said, I will see if there are any questions from any of you.
Yeah, so we have a couple of great ones from the Headwaters Academy. One that stood out to me was, did any men during this time openly support women's rights? And if so, how are they viewed by society?
Yeah, that is a great question. Did men openly support women's rights and how are they viewed? And they most certainly did. There were a lot of men who were suffragists. And there were a lot of men who actually even ran for political office in Montana and in other states, partly on the platform that they would give women the right to vote. So in some ways, they were certainly supported by society, but it was obviously a pretty big battle and argument. In Montana, for example, the legislature voted on women's suffrage several times before it actually became law. So we know that men did support women's suffrage all the way back at the Seneca Falls Convention and going forward. Great question.
Another one we have, also from Headwaters Academy, is what happened if women tried to vote?
They were not allowed to vote.
Let's see. I think those are the ones that were mainly pertinent to this. But yeah, everyone, great questions.
Great questions, everybody, and thank you for those.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you dig in and do a little bit of research like Lisa suggested. We have more programs coming up with Museum of the Rockies. Go to our website, museumoftherockies.org/learn, to see all of our live stream programs. On behalf of Museum of the Rockies and our partners at Streamable Learning, thank you so much for joining us and have a great day.